Tracy.
Shall we start? If you can sit down, just few words. My name is Michael Marin. I'm the new CEO of Annecy. So, hello everyone. Welcome in Annecy. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to those who have come to Annecy for the first time. I hope that you will spend a wonderful week with us. I wish to express my gratitude to Women in Animation and to Les Femmes S'Animent for having chosen Annecy for this day, to organize this day. Change is on the way, and we'll do everything we can do to help and be a leader for this issue. It was our commitment by signing the Charter 50/50 and awarding the MIFA Animation Industry Award last year to Women in Animation. Being an important festival today does not mean having a good programming or a good number of attendees. A festival in the 21st century must be more inclusive, must promote parity, and must make everyone feel in her or his different part of the community. So thanks for pushing us to be a better festival. Have a nice day and have a great week in Annecy. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Marge Dean. I'm president of Women in Animation. I wanted to also welcome everyone to our third edition of World Summit, the Women in Animation World Summit. And we have a great program in store today. I think probably the strongest one yet. And it, in a lot of ways, will be a culmination of the last two. And hopefully we'll come out at the end of the day with some really concrete things that we're all committed to doing to really influence the industry and help us hit 50/50 by 2025. And there'll be some valuable information and insights, so I hope you all can stay with us for most of the day, because at every point there is another really interesting panel or another really interesting presentation or discussion. So have a great day, learn a lot, and have some fun.
Hello. I wanted to tell you about many initiatives that have been launched this past year in France as well, because it has been a huge year for us in France, and a lot of very interesting initiatives have been occurred. Among them, the amazingly active movement 50/50 in 2020, battling for equality and inclusion in cinema, challenging our public institutions as well as private entities, professional unions, festivals, etc. I don't know if Judith Nora is here. She's representing this association. LFA supports this movement, which initiated last year the Chart of Equality that was signed by Annecy, but signed also by all the A-list festivals worldwide, which is a big achievement. And another huge achievement last January in France, the CNC here introduced a new subsidy bonus for movies with women in key roles, like directors, director of animations, head of storyboards, things like that, both for live action and animated movies at the same time, which was huge for us this year. And in March, Julie Gaillet, who created in France an hashtag Maintenant on agit, invited all the different associations working in the areas of equality and diversity in French medias to share thoughts and ideas. Directors, scriptwriters, actresses, journalists, producers are now all sharing thoughts, so belonging becomes a reality. Let's hope, but it starts. Julie Gaillet will be with us this afternoon because she is a member of the jury here at Annecy this year. So we believe things are changing, and we are now seeing the first results, and we are very happy. I wanted to tell you also that LFA and its partners, CNC, Cube, Cybergroup, Frogbox, Micros, SACD, SPFA, Timto, and 22D, are happy this year to invite you after the summit for a concert in the Chill Out Lounge by a girl called Léonie Pernet. She's a very engaged French electropop woman singer, she has a group, so it's a group, who is also involved in an active movement of women musicians, because it changed everywhere. So, and also don't forget our breakfast each morning at the Chill Lounge this year for the first year as well at 8:30 in the Chill Out zone that are open for everyone, discussing women in Annecy. So have a good day. Bye-bye.
So we're going to kick things off with Julianne Cromit.
Taped. Hold on one second. We're figuring out a mic situation.
Pick the whole thing up.
There we go. Improvise. There you go. Bam. We're improvising this morning. Good morning, everybody. Oh, you can do better than that, Annecy. Good morning, everybody. Ah, there we go. Much better. By the way, everybody who's in the back, we have a ton of seats here in the front. We're going to go ahead and ignore these signs for right now. So if you want to move up, please feel free to do so. Come on up. The front row is open. I promise I won't bite anybody. Come on up. There you go. Great. So if you've been here in some years past, you've heard me speak before. And every year, I try to talk about a different theme that we're reflecting on for the day. As people get settled, how many of you were here last year? Great. And then the year before that, for our first one? Oh, great. Growing each year. Christine, quick question. Where's the clicker? Do we have one? Thank you, love. So this year's theme is the theme of belonging. And if you'll recall in previous years, thank you so much, love. If you'll recall in previous years, all right, hold on. Click. There's me. We discussed about the theme of unconscious bias and diversity. Then we talked about the theme of inclusion. And now we're talking about the theme of belonging. All of these ideas are actually interconnected. We've done this purposefully so that we can think about all the different angles in which we actually make change. And we actually move the needle forward when it comes to gender equity and really when it comes to representation overall. A little bit about me. So there's my fun slide. For those of you who don't know me, my day job is that I lead diversity and inclusion for the Walt Disney Studios out of Burbank, California. Yeah! Woo! My responsibility is around market, people, and culture. So the content we make, who makes them, how do we look internally, and then how are we building a culture of inclusion every day? And then my job with WIA is that I serve as the lead on inclusion, and I'm WIA's secretary, serving on the executive committee as well as the board, with an incredible organization that we are now 4,200 members strong, Marge? 4,200 members strong. And a little bit about my own personal background. I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Yes, I also speak Spanish. It's my first language. Whoa. I was raised outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and have lived in California now for over a decade. I am a proud Boricua and Cubana. My mom is also Cuban. And I wear my Latinidad, as I like to say, on a daily basis. And I always like to identify myself because I think it's important that we all actually see each other and hear each other for all the different identities that we are. So I'm going to do a little recap on the previous themes, unconscious bias, diversity, inclusion, and then introduce this new theme of belonging to set us up right into the USC research report with the incomparable Dr. Stacy Smith and Dr. Kate Pieper. So starting with unconscious bias, you all, because this is like a checkup we get every year, we're going to do it again because we always need to refresh ourselves on concepts. It's not enough to hear it once. We have to keep going back, right, and reminding ourselves of all these things. So let's remember the definition of unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is the result of shortcuts that our brain takes because of the amount of data we have to process at any given moment. So I'm going to say that again, reminder. It is the result of shortcuts that our brain takes because of the amount of data we have to process at any given moment. And a little refresher course, you've seen this slide before, some of you, we receive 11 million bits of data. New studies actually say it might be 14 million bits. That's due to a lot of our screen time. 11 million bits of data at any given moment, and we can only consciously process 40 bits. So as a reminder, 99.9999996% of everything we think is unconscious. All right? That is how our brain is operating on a daily basis, which sometimes means we go to defaults and we create shortcuts because it's easier to function on a day-to-day basis. You remember in previous ones I talked about it was for our survival back in the day, but then today, now it causes us sometimes to go to stereotype, to assumptions, and to blind spots that we have. So even a tiny bit of bias can have a big difference. Remember that these biases, they add up in our brain over time. It's not just a single one and done, but it's the shortcuts that we're taking on a daily basis. And that sometimes can prohibit us from thinking inclusively, from creating spaces that are inclusive, which is a bit about belonging, but also can cause even more sort of dire consequences when we look at how bias slips in over time and we see representation then slip in or lack or slip down the slope when that bias slips in. So Stacy and Kate are going to talk about this in greater detail, but essentially as bias creeps in an organization, we often see representation decrease across different ethnic groups, genders, etc. So let's refresh the types of biases. Oh yes, we're going to do this slide again, folks, just to remind ourselves, because it connects to everything you're about to hear from USC too. So social biases, if you'll recall, these are the biases that happen between our interactions with each other, right? Like me bias is the most common type. So like me bias is that we tend to favor and like people who are like us. We're real great humans. We really like people that are like us. So think about when you meet somebody or you see a resume from somebody who's from your hometown or who grew up in the same neighborhood or who went to your same school. You know that warm, fuzzy feeling you get in your stomach? You get so excited. That's like me bias. You know nothing about this human, literally, except they are from your same hometown or went to the same school. I'd like you to think about everybody you grew up with or everybody you went to school with. Did you like all of those people? You see, like me bias. And it works really nicely with memory bias. So memory bias is about the way that our brain processes memory or the events that happen to us. Recency bias is a very common type of memory bias. Recency bias is when we actually take the most recent set of events and we substitute it for the whole data set. So a clear example of that is, you know, when you're doing either a performance review on somebody, or you're maybe thinking about giving somebody a promotion, or maybe bringing somebody over to your team, you might think about the most recent interaction with that person, as opposed to maybe the last year of interaction or 2 years of interaction. That's recency bias. Now think about if you had a really negative interaction recently with somebody, and they are not like you. You have just double sort of negated somebody simply by those two elements. And then think about the opposite. What if somebody is like you and you had a recent positive interaction with them? You've just preferenced them doubly over that other person, simply just by social bias and memory bias. Crazy, right? Add that in to decision-making bias. So decision-making bias is bias based on the previous decisions that we've made without looking at a new data set. A really common trope of this we broke last year at the Walt Disney Company, which was that pesky rumor that black-led films don't do well outside the United States. And a really funny thing happened called Black Panther. And $1.3 billion later, it seems like they do. And so decision-making bias is that 20 years in Hollywood, that was a belief that people were holding on to from decisions that they were using to justify that belief. So they said, oh, this movie didn't do well, so this must be true, right? But guess what? It's really not empirically in any way, shape, or form. So that's how decision-making bias can actually play out in some really damaging ways in thinking about how we make content or who makes content. And then you add that into a new one I've thrown in this year. You see, folks, when I do a recap, sometimes I throw something in new, which is us versus them bias. So this is the bias that comes from when you preference your in-group versus somebody else, and you believe that your truth is better than theirs around the same topic. This has never happened before. And it can happen in many different ways. Often when you're bringing two teams together and you're meeting that other team for the first time, you might think the way we've done things is the right way over the way they've done things, without actually thinking about what's the best from both teams, and if we brought that together, could we actually make something greater? So that's how us versus them bias often plays out, and then think about it harnessed with decision-making bias, adding any decision that you made in the past to the way that you've done things, and suddenly, oh, you have a recipe of either conflict or a no-go. So think about those times when you're able to actually stop and say, wait a minute, how could I learn the best from the other group that's coming here, as opposed to maybe assuming the way I've always done things or we've always done things is actually better. So think about when you're making those preferences as you think about unconscious bias. And then I always bring this example back because it's an oldie but a goodie. Everybody pull out your phones, if you have them, your smart devices, up in the air. Oh no, this is interactive, folks. There you go. Bonnie already has hers up. There you go. Everybody up there. I want you to hold it in your dominant hand. So whether you're right-handed or left-handed, hold in your dominant hand. And if you were to watch a video on your phone and you wanted to watch it in landscape mode, how might you turn your phone? Right-handed people, which way do you turn your phone? To the left? That way. And then left-handed people, which way do you typically turn your phone if you don't switch hands? To the right? Anybody? Do we have any left-handed people? Yeah. Which way do you usually turn it? To the other way, to the right, yep. So when Google launched the iOS uploader for YouTube, about 10% of the videos were loading upside down, and nobody could figure out why. Left-handers, as you might know, about 10% of the global population is left-handed, and there had been no left-handed engineers on the design team. So nobody thought to turn the phone the other way. So when people were uploading their videos and they were a left-handed device user, their video kept loading upside down. And so this caused a huge uproar, time, money, a PR nightmare, right? And it could have easily been fixed by a left-handed engineer being in the room and just turning the phone the other way. This is an example of how unconscious bias can play out in kind of a non-typical way that you might not think about, which is handedness, literally, perspective of using a device in a room. And it wasn't, let's be clear, it wasn't that the right-handed engineers walked in that day and said, today's the day. We're gonna get the lefties. It was that they literally didn't think to turn the phone the other way. It was their blind spot. It was their blind spot. So I want you to think about, as we transition out of this unconscious bias section, what are my blind spots? What are the things that if I were thinking about it differently, or had different people in the room, or had a different team that I brought together, what might we see or catch that we would miss in any other circumstance? And maybe it's as simple as just turning the phone the other way. With that, last year we talked about this topic of inclusion. And if you recall, what inclusion means is the process of including and using the power of differences and similarities to achieve a common goal or objective. It's very important, the phrasing of this, the power of differences and similarities to achieve a common goal or objective. It's going to tie very closely to belonging, which is why I want to make sure to focus on that language. It's not just the facts that we are similar that create inclusion, but also things that make us different than create inclusion, because it's about recognizing those differences and leveraging each other's differences and similarities to achieve a common goal. And so with that, I want to pause and talk about intersectionality for a minute. It's also going to be in the research you'll see in a moment, which is the analytical framework which attempts to identify how interlocking systems of power, which often have to do with identity, impact those who are marginalized in society. So when we talk about intersectional identity, it often refers to all the things that make up our identity. I am Latina and I am a woman, right? I'm also American. Those are all things that make up my identity and my perspective. And we often talk about people in single identity silos, but that's how none of us actually live our lives. So when we think about intersection and we think about inclusion, It's about thinking about all the different types of perspective that somebody is bringing to the table, and then leveraging, again, the power of the similarities and differences between us to get to a better and more common goal. And just because I always like to throw in some numbers for our business people, this was a study from Deloitte and Burson that happened just over a year ago about how inclusive teams have better outcomes. They studied a myriad of companies across Fortune 500 organizations, and they had some pretty astonishing findings. Cultures of those companies that were more inclusive across multiple measurements had better financial and business results across the board, and you can see it here. 6 times more likely to be innovative, 6 times more likely to be agile and be able to pivot with change, 3 times more likely to be high performing, 8 times more likely to have better business outcomes overall. Think about that, 8 times more likely, and 2 times more likely to meet or exceed financial targets. So the idea of bringing all perspectives together and creating an environment where those perspectives were allowed to thrive created more business, i.e. more money, for all of those organizations. So it's not just because we all feel good and warm and fuzzy and we're advocates here for women in animation, but this has real business underpinnings and undertones into what can happen when you actually build an environment that's inclusive, that actually considers for all those forms of identity. And this is a new one, again, because I like to throw new things in here, folks, is an example of what inclusive design means when you think about it applied to a particular space or a particular idea. So what does it mean when I talk about inclusion, but actually design applied to design, or the way that you think about the world? This is an example. So when in the United States, there was an Accessibility Act that was passed that just ensured that every place and space in our country was more accessible to those who needed it to be, that there were accommodations and there were ways for people to more easily get around in the world. And one of those things was to create crosswalks where you could actually be able to lower yourself to cross without needing to step over a curb. So for example, if you had a mobility need, this was an accommodation for you to be able to actually cross safely across the street. Now, something really incredible happened when these were installed at crosswalks. The number of pedestrian fatalities crossing the street of every person went down. And you wonder why. So when you're not paying attention and you get to a corner and it goes down as opposed to staying the same, it's your cue that you are at an intersection and you stop. So every person, because now this cue existed of the sidewalk going down, actually started stopping more, and we saved human lives. And this is what happens when you actually think about inclusive design and inclusive design theory, is that when you actually design something for the most affected group of people, for the people that actually needed that design change the most, you actually make it better for the whole. And in this case, it actually saved all lives, not just the ones who needed that mobility access. And I think that's an incredible application of when you think about what inclusion can really do. It's not even just about our day-to-day, but it could have real-world consequences, ones that actually make our society better and actually, as I was saying, increase that bottom line in multiple ways. So as you're thinking about how can I restructure my team or think about the ways in which I approach my art on a daily basis, something to think about is this sidewalk design. What could I be doing that actually is going to make it better for a most affected group of people, but then actually make it better for the whole? And with that, this comes really nicely into the topic of belonging, which is today's topic. And I think what I really like about the last example is it shows how changing a space can actually make somebody feel more included and actually feel like they belong. And belonging is when we really talk about the organization and the things that are around human beings to make them feel like they exist. I'm going to bring it back because it's an oldie as a goodie. You remember I always say, and this is from Verna Myers, that being diversity is being invited to the party. Remember that? Inclusion is being asked to dance. And belonging, today's theme, is that your music is played. There we are. your music is played. And so when we think about the spaces and places that we live in, that's why I love that sidewalk example, it's about that the music is being played. So the minute somebody walks into a space, the way that it is organized, acted, and actually exists makes people feel like they are seen and heard immediately. That's what we're talking about today. And you see why we couldn't start there. We couldn't start you on belonging. That would be like, whoa, huh? But we had to start you on being invited, being asked to dance. And now, today, we're at that place, right, of your music being played. So with that, I'm going to go through a definition and a few examples of what I mean by that. And hopefully it will start to illuminate and share some ideas as we get into the data. So what does belonging mean? Workplace belongingness is the extent to which the individual feels personally accepted, respected, included, and supported by others in the organizational environment. So acceptance, respect, inclusion, and support. Again, you see why we had to do inclusion last year. It's critical in how you think about belonging. So how is the spaces and places we are designing make it so people feel accepted, respected, included, and supported? So I'm going to use a few examples from a couple of different angles. This one is from the hiring practices angle. So as you're thinking about hiring, whether in your organization, your team, or you yourself are going in and interviewing, there are many things you can think about that actually start to already project an environment of belonging, even before somebody has joined the organization or that you yourself have decided, am I going to join the organization? And one of those things is when you look at job descriptions can often have coded language in them. And what I mean by that, it's been studied that when certain phrases that are coded male often are in job descriptions, women won't apply for the job. In tech, some of the words that have been highlighted are wizard and magician as places. I mean, I'm not a magician during my day job, so I feel like that's a bit odd, but magician and wizard were languages or words that were used in different job descriptions, and it was turning off women even from applying. The other pesky thing is women do this funny thing where if we don't meet all the requirements in a job description, we often don't apply for the role. Men, when they read a job description, will apply for the role when they meet, about 60% of what's in the job description. And so when you think about something as simple as that, a job posting, think about what language is being involved, and also think about, are you listing just the very core criteria of what needs to be done in the job? Nothing additional, just the core criteria. Thinking about those very basic things start to make people feel like they belong even as they're just applying for the job. Or if you're the candidate, doesn't that make you feel like, I can actually be a part of this place? Another thing to do is actually state your intention around inclusion at the very top of any job posting or in places where people can find information about you or about your organization so that they know your values right up top. So those are just a few examples you think about hiring practices. Another thing too is when you think about interviewing or when people come in for an interview, isn't it nice when you see a lot of different kinds of people who interview who are from all different backgrounds or different parts of the organization? Really important as you're setting up interviews or you yourself are being interviewed is to ask and or already have given to you a diverse slate of individuals that can actually show you the 360 of what the organization looks and feels like. So you start to actually not only see yourself, but actually see the diversity of what's available within the organization. That's another way that you can create belonging right away. Another thing to think about, remember I talked about physical spaces with the sidewalk, is actually how is your space decorated, your office environment actually decorated, that creates a sense of what we call ambient belonging. And I know because I'm laughing because I know Stacy's going to talk about this. I know. But ambient belonging is when a space actually just naturally has a feeling of inclusivity in the way that it's designed and what's on the walls. So a way that you can not create ambient belonging is when there's incredibly sort of gendered things on the wall. An example of that might be posters of different movies or television shows that might feel very specific to a different background or a particular type of person. Another way is actually the physical space itself. You know, we were just talking about the sidewalks actually having accessibility. If a space itself actually feels more accessible to folks in a really like tangible, real way, that can make you feel included right away. If, for example, you need to get around in a different way or in a way that's unique to you. So those are just ways of thinking about what does it mean when I'm bringing somebody in an organization and I'm existing in an organization. And then this is something we can all do every day because we're all in meetings at some point during the day probably, whether it's creative meetings, business meetings, whatever it might be in your day-to-day. And I like to use this example. It's from Glenn Mazzara. Anybody here a fan of The Walking Dead? Circulate, High and proud. Who's fans of The Walking Dead? There you go. You've stuck it out, too. I love it. Zombies are still going. They're just still going. So Glenn Mazzara was the showrunner of The Walking Dead in seasons 2 and 3. He was also showrunner on The Shield and on Damien. He's a big advocate for inclusion in Hollywood. And he talks about his experiences very openly as a self-identified straight cis white male. And he was showrunning, and I would believe it was on The Shield. And he noticed that 2 mid-level writers, so these were 2 sort of experienced writers who were women, were not talking in the room. And he couldn't figure out why. So he approached them after one of the sessions, one of the writing meetings that day, and he said, "You're not talking, what's going on?" And they go, "Well, we would, but we keep being interrupted." He goes, "What are you talking about?" He hadn't noticed. He was actually genuinely asking, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Well, why don't you watch?" And so the next day, he came in the room. He didn't say anything about the conversation, obviously, to anybody. And he just sat back and he observed the room. And they were indeed being interrupted. So he decided the next day, he came in with a new rule for the room. He said, "From now on, when we come in with prepared pitches," which means you're coming in, right, with a prepared idea to share with the room, nobody interrupts anybody while they are pitching. Nobody interrupts anybody. And he didn't say it was because the women in the room were being interrupted. Very important. He just said, nobody interrupt anybody. And guess what happened? Everybody had to listen to everybody else's ideas in full, without interruption. And that made the room more productive, actually made them more efficient, because they were actually listening through everybody's ideas, so things stopped being repeated all the time because you were actually listening through. And it made the room more creative because he had actually created a sense of belonging by introducing that one meeting practice change. And he said he now does it in every room. It's a standard rule that he puts forward and has never looked back. And for those in the room, in case you're curious, what was happening from an unconscious bias level, because I like to connect the dots, is that voices, our ears, are actually trained to register lower registered voices more than higher pitched voices. And so if multiple sounds are coming in, we tend to hear much more frequently the lower registered pitches, which is often why when women are interrupted, it goes to a male voice in the room. And so he himself also did the exercise of becoming more conscious of that as he had implemented the no interruption rule. Again, creating a better sense of belonging, and him as a leader taking on that responsibility. So if you're a leader in a room or you're often in creative settings, think about just those 1 or 2 changes that could actually change the whole for everybody else in terms of a feeling of belonging in the room. And guess what? It's going to become more powerful and more creative almost overnight. And then I'm going to end this on this particular note because I think it connects to the idea that we as storytellers actually have a profound role in how we create a sense of belonging in our audience and how we actually can debunk stereotypes, which actually create a sense or could actually go against a sense of belonging on a day-to-day basis. Chimamanda Adichie is this amazing writer from Nigeria. If you haven't read the book Americana, I highly recommend it. She has a very powerful TED Talk on the, quote, the danger of a single story. And the idea is that for the longest time, because of power and access and many other things, we only know the single narratives that are told to us either by our family, by the media we create and consume, and by the stereotypes therein. And it's not necessarily anybody's fault, in a sense, that we have those single stories, but it is necessarily our responsibility to think about them in a different way. So when we're together in a room and we're trying to create a sense of belonging, it's really hard when we often only have a single narrative about each other and about where you're from and who you are and what you might be about and the assumptions we might make about people, right? One I get a lot is because I also speak Spanish, but I have no accent in English. People often say something like, "How is your English so good?" Or, "Why don't you have an accent?" Without understanding that people can be multilingual, right, and not necessarily have an accent in any particular language. But for that person, the only representation they know of a Latin person is that they have a heavy accent. That's the only single story they know. And so as we're thinking about this idea of belonging today, I want you to reflect on this idea of the single story and how we actually have the power as storytellers to debunk those single stories and also empower voices from all different backgrounds to tell their own stories as part of the multifaceted and multi-layered existence that they and us and we all live. And as we do that, that will also help tremendously in our own sense of belonging, both ambient and direct. And I will bring her back because she's my hero. And this was no truer in my own life than when I saw Betty from Ugly Betty, or Betty La Fea, on screen for the first time, because it's the first time I saw my life reflected in any way that was more multi-layered and not a single narrative. And I somehow knew I belonged in a completely different way, because she didn't have to choose between being Latin and being an executive in a company, right? Or being a woman. That she could be all of those things and be her fabulous, glorious, multi-layered self. But more importantly, the world saw a representation of somebody who was Latina that was all of those things, which starts to break down the narrative of the single story. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't a gang member. She wasn't somebody doing something terrible. She was somebody living her life and making an impact. And so when we think about the idea of belonging, again, please reflect on the idea of the single narrative and how we can start to break what those narratives mean. Because in the long run, that's really what we have to do, so we start to understand each other in all those multi-layered and multifaceted ways. And more importantly, not just for yourself, but for all the people who don't have the other narratives yet on what your existence is like. And with that quick recap, unconscious bias, the result of shortcuts that our brain takes because of the amount of data we have to process at any given moment. Diversity being invited to the party, inclusion being asked to dance, and belonging that your music is played. And I should add, and that you can boogie, which is my little addition. And with that today, with the single narrative, what will you commit to doing after today in your work or in your organization, and how can we help you achieve that? We're here to be your partner throughout all of this. That's why we're here every year and why we keep reflecting on all the different topics and ideas to get us there. So throughout today, again, continue to reflect on the power and the destruction of a single narrative and how we can change that. And then what can you do to make that impact so that we can all start to feel a deeper sense of belonging. And with that, I'm going to introduce our next speakers. Please. Thank you so much. Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing two great friends. Stacey, are you going to come up first, or you're coming up together? Oh, I love it. Okay, so I will introduce two great friends and partners in change and inclusion in the industry. Dr. Stacey Smith is the founder and director of the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative at USC, the University of Southern California, the leading global think tank studying inequality in media. Dr. Smith's groundbreaking research examines inclusion which is gender, race, ethnicity, the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, and mental health across film, TV, and digital platforms, the music industry, and film criticism. Beyond research, Dr. Smith crafts compelling and innovative solutions to entertainment's inequality. Recently, in partnership with Time's Up, Tessa Thompson, and others, she launched the 4% Challenge. She was deemed one of the Hollywood Reporter's 50 Agents of Change just about a month and a half ago. Dr. Stacy Smith. And Dr. Catherine Pieper is a research scientist at the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, where she contributes to the initiative's work across film, TV, and digital media, music, and film criticism. She received her PhD from USC Annenberg, and she's extremely funny. So with that, Dr. Stacy Smith and Dr. Kate Pieper.
It's always an unenviable task to follow Julianne Crommett. Was that not amazing? Amazing. Thank you. Well, I just have to give you a little warning. She talked about having 11 bits of data coming at you at any given moment. We're going to amp that up to about 13 million in the next 30, 35, 40 minutes. So buckle up. We often move fast. As you all know, the conversation around inclusion in the entertainment industry has really reached a fever pitch. But oftentimes that conversation is really about live action. Let's think about this. The Directors Guild puts out a report every year talking about the percentage of directors that are working in episodic live action series. The Writers Guild puts out a report that I don't believe that animation is considered in. And the Producers Guild, well, they don't put out a report every year in the United States, so we're not sure how producers are doing in the industry. And so,
we know.
We know, right, in which we will share with you today. We do interrupt each other, so we need a no interruption rule that Glenn has, but that might happen up here as we've worked together a very long time. We thought it was really important when WIA came to us and asked us if we'd be interested in doing a large-scale analysis of inclusion in animation. We enthusiastically said yes, and there are 3 people that we really have to acknowledge in the room today that helped tremendously, not only partnering with women in animation, but personally were resources to us. And of course, one of those individuals was Julianne Crommett, but also Tracy Campbell and Marge Dean for their incredible effort. So please join me in thanking them. 2 other people deserve recognition. We actually had an animation whisperer at our disposal, and that was Bonnie Arnold, who's also in the room, that helped us tremendously with this effort. And because of the generous support of women in animation, we actually had a junior fellow on that project who flew from Los Angeles to be here today, and that's Hannah Clark, who helped tremendously. So our goal really today with unveiling this comprehensive overview of inclusion in animation, and this is probably our most comprehensive report that we've actually done today. It's actually our 45th report on inclusion, and I think as a team, we're quite proud of the ecosystem approach that we've taken to really illuminate how women and women of color in particular are doing in very varied facets of the animation industry. So we had one overarching question that we wanted to answer when it came to this investigation. And that question was this very simple query. How inclusive is the animation industry when it comes to access and opportunity for women? This very small question was put before us, and to answer it, we actually conducted 7 different investigations. We looked across film and television, who's working above the line in animation, as directors, producers, actors, who's working below the line, 9 different unit heads or positions in film, 5 unit heads in television, and then how are the executive ranks performing when it comes to inclusion across 11 different production companies or studios directly involved with animation and 14 different television-based companies. In addition to this quantitative work, which I'll be covering, we also did a series of qualitative investigations where we interviewed 38 women who are in their early career in the animation space and asked them about the barriers and opportunities in animation. We talked to men and women who are executives and asked them very similar questions. And then with the support of the Animation Guild, we surveyed over 250 individuals or members of the Guild. I'll cover the quantitative portion of the study. Kate will cover the qualitative portion. We like to split it up because it helps to focus as we change back and forth on the information. I also have to warn you, Kate is nicer and funnier, as Julianne said, so be prepared for that. I usually get to deliver the bad news, and today we are living up to that. Please feel free to tweet out the slides and the study. We want to garner as much interest and social media attention to the research as possible. And it's a good way to let folks know where the animation industry is doing well and where there's always room for improvement. So to answer our first question, how inclusive is the animation industry, we start by looking at who's on screen. And if you just take a look at how females are doing on screen in animation, if you look across 120 of the most popular films from 2007 to 2018, or the 100 animated television series, the first episode or segment, you see that we're far away from a 50% goal. Females are 50% of the box office, 50% of the population, and well over half of the viewing audience on television. There are only 17% of the leads or co-leads in the 120 top animated films. There are only 3% of those films feature a woman of color driving the action. Moana, Princess and the Frog, and then of course one of the Blue Smurfs was voiced by an individual from an underrepresented racial ethnic group. You see that television is doing a bit better here when it comes to on-screen representation. 39% of all speaking characters that were credited were female, girls and women on screen, and we see a higher proportion, 12%, of non-Caucasian girls and women being credited in those storylines. When we move from on-screen to who's calling the shots, it starts to explain why we might see fewer women actually on the small or large screen. When we take a look at how female directors are doing in animation, it's actually quite rare to see a woman calling the shots in the director's chair. When we look to film, only 3% of all film directors were women. That's 5 jobs, 5 opportunities. It's actually only 4 because Jennifer Nelson got to work twice. And there are only 13% of the first episode or first segment across 100 of the top animated series. Only 13% feature a female director. Only 2% of those are women of color. And what's interesting, all of the women of color across film and television were of Asian descent. So we're not even seeing representation behind the camera across different racial or ethnic groups or multiracial or biracial storytellers behind the scenes. Now, it's always a fun day when I get to share positive news, and so it's really nice that I get to say something positive for once. And so this was one of our most pronounced findings. And this is something that I think is really important as we continue our conversations throughout the day and we think about belonging. And Kate will talk more about belonging in a moment. Belonging is really you fit in and your work is validated, kind of a shortcut to Julianne's definition. And we see something happening in the producerial ranks. We looked at produced by credits. capital P producers in live action and animation. And we found that in animated films over the last, from 2007 to 2018, 37% of all producers were women. 37%. Actually, that statistic is completely unheard of because only 15% of producers in live action were women. So we're actually seeing animation lead for the first time in a very pronounced way over 12 years, 13 years of content. Now, I want to point out something that's really important here when we were talking about bias earlier. You see in live action, it's the yellow bars, you see a flat line. There's really no change, which suggests that implicit and explicit biases are operating in terms of who's getting opportunities to produce in live action films. But in animation, you actually see a curvilinear trend. You see increases followed by decreases, followed by increases, which is really important because it illuminates that women are getting access and opportunity, because this is typically the pattern you should see when there is less bias involved in decision making. There's one other really important point to this slide. The lows for animation, 12%, 22%, 26%, 31%, they're increasing over time. So what's going on in organizations when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and belonging? Something is working really well to ensure that women are in these positions. And Kate's going to talk about one of the reasons why, particularly from an unconscious bias perspective, this might be happening and how we might need to course correct, not only within the producerial ranks, but how this affects the executive ranks and directing as well. One last point, very few women are getting women of color are getting the opportunity to produce, whether it's in live action or in the animation spaces. And given the changes, particularly in the US, regarding Gen Z, the most diverse workforce that we've seen thus far, these patterns are very behind when it comes to thinking who's in decision making and can affect the product of a feature film or a television show. Now, when we think about television, we see that producers aren't doing quite as well. 17 to 20% of executive producers, co-executive producers, or created, developed by credits are held by women. Very few women of color. And we see them at the producerial level again, but not the top decision-making capacity or role. And so there's room in television, again, to really think, how do you strategize and thrust women into those positions? What are the barriers that they're facing, which Kate will address in just a few minutes, to get them into those more prestigious positions. Now, as we move from directing and producing, it becomes important to also think about below the line. And so looking at the last 5 years of animated content, or the top 52 films, we see that there's very few women in film that are getting the opportunities as unit heads or in key roles behind the camera. It ranges anywhere from 2%, the head of layout, all the way up to 21%, the head of lighting. And so there's a real, I think, opportunity here to think critically about where women are falling out in the pipeline, which we'll illuminate in just a few minutes. More problematically, we see women of color in multiple positions not filling any of the key roles, or only between 3 and 6% of all of these unit head or department head positions working below the line. Now, interestingly, television is a bit better below the line. And we see here a range from 11% as a low, lead storyboard artists, all the way up to story editors, which are about 28% of those key positions. Again, women of color, anywhere from 1% to 13%. So if we really think about a target goal of about 50%, whether it's directing, producing, below the line in film or below the line in television, we see a real disconnect between population norms, audience norms, and hiring practices in film and television. Now, another interesting area to think about is who's at the pinnacle of power. And this is literally the most exciting slide, I think, in my career that I ever get. I was shocked, and I would swear if this wasn't live streamed, from what I understand it is, so I won't use profanity. But this I've never seen before. And it gets back to this point of there is something happening in animation. There's inclusion and belonging. And for different reasons, we might see these numbers, a variety of reasons, but we have never seen this before, and I want you to focus specifically on the column from film. We took a look at all of the executive ranks across 11 companies in film, 14 companies in television, and we ranked the executives from presidents, chief creative officers, and chief executive officers all the way to the VP level and in the director level, but the director level isn't on this slide. And what you can see in film is that for the first time, 50% of the most prestigious positions running this particular portion of the entertainment industry are filled with women. Animation, good job. Now, there's a very common pattern that we see. It's typically when power increases, females' participation decreases. And you can see that from the VP level all the way up to the top level in television. But you see 50% of all senior vice presidents being held by women in film, and over 68% of vice presidents and heads being women in film. So there's a very strong pipeline in a particular medium that has often been resistant to putting women in these executive ranks. Now, where there's room for vast improvement is in the television lane, but also for putting women of color into these positions. Only out of the 23 women of color who are executives across both film and television, all but 2 were at the SVP level or below. So a lot of these numbers really pertain to Caucasian women, again, not reflecting the reality of the audience and consumers, and so room for much improvement. Now, as we move from the executive ranks, we need to start thinking about the pipeline, and we're going to think about the pipeline in a couple of ways. The first, I don't have a slide, but I want to present the information. One of the things that we did that was really important, we wanted to know what was going on in animation programs in the United States. So we surveyed the top 6 animation programs, USC, UCLA, Ringling, SVA, Rhode Island, and CalArts. We asked them for their data on animation programs, and every institution gave it to us. Fully half or more of all enrolled or intending students over the last 3 years, from 2016 to 2018, half or more were women. And in particular, in 2016, 65% of all those enrolled or attending, 65% were women in 2016, and in 2018, it was 69%. So there is a very strong pipeline coming out of the institutions that are training individuals to come into the animation space. Secondly, we looked at the proportion of women submitting and having their animated short films played at the top film festivals in the United States. We looked at Sundance, South by, Telluride, Tribeca, and the New York Film Festival. Sure enough, women are submitting short films in increasing numbers. Overall, 47% across all 3 years of the animated shorts submitted and accepted had a female director attached. And what you can see over the last 3 years is a linear increase of 33% in 2016 to 60% of animated shorts had a female director attached in 2018. So the pipeline is actually very strong. And so when we compare the pipeline to what's going on in the different tracks, whether it's directing or producing, it makes us start to wonder where women are actually dropping off. And my last slide really illuminates, we're moving from about 2/3 in the animated program space in schools, about half of all shorts that are animated have a female director attached, And then the pipeline for directing in features really illuminates. We have 3% directors across 120 animated features from 2007 to 2018. Only 7 to 9% of the key roles or unit heads leading to directing. We've lost the women. They're not in the unit head positions. They're not having access and opportunity. And if you look at storyboard, the story department, and animation, we see that we're down to less than a fifth in these particular gatekeeping positions or the path to directing in features. So overall, in summing up all this information, we see strong producing numbers, particularly in film, producing in television, strong executive ranks data in film with work to be done for women of color and in the television ranks, but directing, on screen, and below the line, there's much work to be done, and it seems as if inclusion and belonging are a real problem for retention, access, and opportunity for women in this particular space. So we asked our second major question: what explains the lack of women in the animation industry? And to answer this small query, I will turn it over to Dr. Pieper.
Who's apparently going to also provide a comedy routine.
Right,
Who knew?
exactly.
Who knew that was part of the morning? Right, so we were interested not just in the numbers, but to understand why we see fewer women in certain roles throughout the animation industry. And so we conducted a qualitative analysis. We love to count, we love to amass the numbers, but we also love to talk to people and find out what's happening, what their experiences are, and where they see bias in the industry. And so as you heard, we had three main components to this qualitative analysis. We conducted in-depth interviews with 38 women in their early career. Their average age was 29, and about a third of them were from underrepresented racial or ethnic groups. We additionally talked to 37 decision makers. 30% of them were men. About 20% were underrepresented. Their average age was 50, so a good cross-section of decision makers in the industry. And then in partnership with the Animation Guild, we conducted a survey of over 250 individuals. Almost half of them were men. About a third of them, again, were underrepresented. And their average age was around 43. So we actually had the opportunity to hear from a lot of different voices working in animation about some of the things that are happening in the industry and where they see issues for women in moving up in career paths. And what we did was we asked three main questions that we'll talk about. We gave people data. It was really important to us that we ground the questions that we asked in the actual statistics. So we told them how many directors had worked over the last 12 years, and we said, why are there so few female directors? And then we listened to what they had to say. We asked them, we gave them data, and we said, comparatively, why are there so many more female producers than directors? And then we asked, with data from the Animation Guild, on why there's a lack of gender parity in the animation industry more broadly. And so across these three questions, a few different themes emerged that we'll talk through today, and they really provide a picture of what limits the participation of women in the animation industry. And because we're educators, we're going to do a little teaching. So that's exciting for all of you. Hopefully you'll learn something. So the first major theme that emerged is this idea that women are hampered by homophily. And so we like to use the research-based terms, but this is, homophily really just means what Julianne told you about before, which is this like-me bias, the tendency for people to form relationships with those who are alike on some salient characteristics. So whether it's gender or race or the place where you went to university, those might be characteristics that people use to form relationships. We like people who are like us. And when we asked about directors, people told us that there's a masculine culture in animation. And it was important to us to talk about this, not with the term that people typically use, which is the idea of the boys' club, right? But to talk about the social biases and the processes that actually limit women's participation, rather than just to defer to the idea that, it's a boys' club, who knows what that means. And what they told us was that when we asked about directors, about half of the women that we talked to, about a third of the decision makers, and about a quarter of the guild members said that there's a male-dominated culture that's perpetuated in animation and that prevents women from working in leadership. When we asked more broadly about employment generally, we heard the same thing from a little over a third of the early career women, about 20% of the decision makers, and about a third of the guild members. And as an example, we heard that men in charge give jobs to people they feel comfortable with, typically other men, and they don't see women as capable leaders. And so this was really evocative to us of this a male preference and culture that exists in animation. And the reason that this is so important is when we start to think about belonging, we know that stereotypical environments, right, environments in which people don't feel a sense of belonging, can reduce interest and perceptions in the career itself. So if women walk into a space where they feel that they don't see women who are like them, where they experience stereotypical role models or a lack of what's called ambient belonging, it can reduce the perception that they're even interested in going into the field or that they'll be successful. And so you'll see attrition as a result. We also know that greater attention to environmental cues are paid by women when they anticipate feeling what's called a social identity threat. So in one experiment, when they told women they were about to interact with a sexist man, they devoted more attention to looking for those environmental cues than to the task that they were supposed to do. And so this is really important because if you think about what people are supposed to do at their jobs, it's their job. Right? You want them to show up and do the tasks that are assigned or given to them, not to be scanning the environment for potential cues that they might be under some sort of social identity threat. So the work product can actually be affected by the environments where people work. And so one thing that we also heard in this description across all three of the samples was that the historical legacy of the animation industry plays a role in the culture that exists today. They talked about the ink and paint model, the 9 old men, right? And that's important, but again, we want to make sure that people are comparing with what's happening now in the present and looking at the progress that needs to be made from here forward rather than looking back. And it's possible that the male-skewed environments actually create feelings of the lack of belonging in women. About 18% of the women we talked to said that the male-dominated culture that they were in actually created a personal barrier for their careers. The second thing that we found is that women are viewed as less valuable. So when we asked about directors, we heard that the way that women are perceived, they're perceived to lack experience, they're perceived as risky, they're perceived as less competent in the directing role. And we heard this from about 1/3 of early career women, over half of the decision makers we talked to, and about 1/4 of the guild members. And we said, they told us that women don't move into these directing roles because people feel that they're a risk, and that what makes people feel comfortable is sort of deferring to what's come before. And we found this really interesting because we also heard quite a few stereotypes about what it means to be a director, words that align with more masculine characteristics. So you have to be a visionary, you have to be commanding, right? You have to be tough. And we heard this from about 20% across the board of people in different categories that we talked to. And what was really interesting about this use of stereotypes is what happened when we asked about producers. And when we asked about producers, we also heard about stereotypes. But here, all those stereotypically feminine traits were perceived to be an asset for producing. So over half of the people we talked to said that because women are organized and collaborative and supportive, they were good producers. We also heard some pretty condescending terms, that being more secretarial, administrative, that they were caretakers and helpmates, and it was like parenting to be a producer, which we found really interesting because, you know, we go to work every day and it's nothing like parenting, even though there's quite a few administrative tasks we have to do. Not parenting at all. And so here is where we find really interesting about this is it aligns with a large body of research on leadership traits and what